Hello everyone, this is probably going to be my most important video yet. The other day I uploaded a video talking about why most people will never be good at audio. However, as a follow-up to that, I decided to make a video giving you everything I think you need to know to become an expert at audio. I will have this video reviewed by people who are not experts at audio to find out if they felt that they are experts at audio after watching this video. But even then, it is still unlikely that you will become a true expert at audio just from watching this video. The motivation for this video is not just related to audio, but the fact that in general, people often rely on intuition rather than real knowledge. This video is going to be separated into several chapters, with the first chapter being about digital to analog converters or DACs, the second chapter being about amplifiers, the third chapter being about cables, the fourth chapter being about speakers, the fifth chapter being about rooms, the sixth chapter being about mastering in the song creation process, the seventh chapter being about the head-related transfer function, the eighth chapter being about headphones, and finally the ninth chapter being about lossy versus lossless audio codecs as sort of a miscellaneous topic. In chapter 1, digital to analog converters, I'll be using a physical example to best explain the relative importance. Here we have the Apple USB-C to 3.5mm DAC and amp. For now, we will only be focusing on the DAC portion. Now, what is the purpose of a DAC? It is to convert the ones and zeros in a song file to an analog signal, which can ultimately be played through your headphones. What are the qualities of a good DAC? Firstly, we want low distortion. Here we have the FFT or fast Fourier transform of a 1 kHz tone on the Apple dongle. There is relative importance and audibility thresholds for these measurements, but for example, the Synad score is 98 dB, but if you know what you're doing, you do not need to focus on the Synad score because we can just look at the FFT. To the left, we have the noise floor of the Apple dongle or the measurement equipment. And to the right, we also have the noise floor of the Apple dongle and the measurement equipment, but we can also see distortion in these spikes. So for example, at 2 kHz, you can see a spike which is at around -100 dB. This is called the second harmonic. The 1 kHz tone at 0 dB is the fundamental harmonic. The second harmonic is the most difficult to hear because it is masked by the fundamental. Here we have an image that shows what masking looks like. The closer a sound is to the fundamental, the harder it is to hear because it is likely going to be masked by the fundamental. Aside from the second harmonic at -100 dB, the highest harmonic we see is a fourth harmonic at around -125 dB. Now, in general, anything below -80 dB is going to be inaudible. So from a distortion perspective for an open load, the Apple dongle is fully transparent. Now, regarding the number on the bottom left, 0.99993 kHz, this shows how close the Apple dongle is to the 1 kHz tone that it is supposed to be playing. Generally, any DAC will perform amazingly in this regard. You cannot tell the difference between 0.99993 kHz versus 1 kHz because they are so close to each other. Finally, we have the output voltage, which is the number right above the bottom left one. The output voltage of the Apple dongle is 1 VRMS. Generally, for a single-ended DAC, you want 2 VRMS. The reason for this is that a separated amplifier, like the shit Magni Hearsay, cannot reach its max output power potential with a DAC that does not supply enough voltage. However, if your headphones are very efficient, this will not be a problem. Now, Amir from Audio Science Review did not post an intermodulation distortion for the Apple dongle, but basically, intermodulation distortion is gathered by playing one tone at a specific frequency and another tone at another frequency. For the distortion previously shown for the Apple dongle, this was only for a 1 kHz tone. For intermodulation distortion, you can have a tone at around 100 Hz and another one at around 8 kHz or something. It doesn't really matter. And now you can measure the distortion generated when both tones are playing. But again, generally, this is not a problem because DACs are so good nowadays that anything generated is not going to be audible to the human ear. Signal-to-noise ratio and dynamic range are two terms that technically mean different things, but in reality, higher dynamic range or higher signal-to-noise ratio also means a higher dynamic range, and the max dynamic range of CD quality or 16-bit is 96 dB. There's one important thing to keep in mind about dynamic range when it comes to amplifiers, but I'll get to that in the next section. The maximum dynamic range of 24-bit is 144 dB, but I've not seen a DAC actually hit this, or more importantly, I've not seen a song anywhere close to 144 dB of dynamic range. The generally agreed upon maximum dynamic range of the human ear is 120 dB or less, so even going above 120 dB to 144 dB won't actually get you any benefits. as far as DACs go at least. Next we have time-based errors or jitter. It's kind of hard to explain exactly what jitter sounds like. I'm not an expert in this subject, but again, generally, these things are not going to be audible because DACs are so good nowadays. For example, the Apple dongle has all jitter harmonics below minus 115 dB, which there is no way anyone could actually tell in a blind test. I've linked a source in the description which tries to demonstrate the audibility of jitter with pure tones and music. Now, even though the jitter contents used in the demonstration I linked are going to be much higher than they are for the Apple dongle, you will notice that in general they're not going to be very audible in music, even though they might be more audible for pure tones. Next, we have the filter response of the DAC. Now, Amir does not have this for the Apple dongle, unfortunately, but we can see different filters for the Topping DX3 Pro Plus. The qualities of a good filter for a 44.1 kHz sample rate file is a flat frequency response in the audible band, or generally from 20 Hz to 20 kHz. Now here is the trickier part. Ideally, we want the stop band frequency to be at exactly 22.05 kHz, or 1/2 of the sample rate frequency, which is also known as the Nyquist frequency, which is the highest frequency which can be played from a file of a specific sample rate. And what I mean by a stop band is where exactly the response is fully attenuated. For example, if we look at F5 or the blue filter in this image, we can see that it is fully attenuated less than minus 100 dB at 24 kHz. Now, what you must be thinking is that this does not occur at 22.05 kHz as it is supposed to. Generally, there is a trade-off in achieving a perfect filter response and computing power. Core DACs, for example, are able to achieve a near theoretically perfect attenuation filter, but as a result, they have higher latency. And in the Topping DX3 Pro Plus Filter 1, for example, we can see that it is not flat in the audible band or up to 20 kHz, even though it does attenuate well at 22 kHz. So, what DAC manufacturers often do is have a flat frequency response in the audible band, but they extend the stop band frequency to 24 kHz. The reason for this is to do with the audibility of aliasing. To determine what frequencies aliasing can occur at, we subtract the Nyquist frequency from the stop band frequency, then subtract that number from the Nyquist frequency. For example, if we have a stop band at 24.1 kHz with a 44.1 kHz sample rate, we have a 22.05 kHz Nyquist frequency. 24.1 kHz minus 22.05 kHz is 2.05 kHz. The Nyquist frequency, 22.05 kHz minus 2.05 kHz is 20 kHz. Now, since we cannot hear above 20 kHz, aliasing above 20 kHz does not matter audibly, which is why a filter that attenuates at 24 kHz is audibly transparent. The final thing is whether or not the DAC filters are minimum phase or not. In general, linear phase filters are superior to minimum phase filters because they preserve a flat phase response. The advantage to minimum phase filters is to have a lower latency. I will talk more about phase later when we come to headphones and speakers. I'm not going to get into DSD because it doesn't really matter, but for PCM, you only really need a DAC that can do 44.1 kHz. Nowadays, DAC manufacturers try to market the fact that their DACs can do 768 kHz sample rates, but most people can't hear above 20 kHz. And the maximum frequency that can be reproduced from a 44.1 kHz sample rate file is 22.05 kHz, which is still much higher than most people can hear, and I don't think anyone can actually hear 22.05 kHz. And let's say you want to play a song that has a 96 kHz sample rate with your 44.1 kHz sample rate DAC. Resampling algorithms nowadays are completely transparent audibly, with distortion harmonics well below minus 150 dB for macOS from over 15 years ago, and the phase response is also completely flat. And if you want to use a separate DAC with the PS5, for example, you need one that either supports USB 1 or a DAC that has optical in so that you can plug your TV into your DAC. And that is the end of Chapter 1. Moving on to Chapter 2, Amplifiers. Good characteristics of a DAC often overlap with good characteristics of an amplifier. Starting off with things previously mentioned, we want low distortion and low noise. Here we have the FFT of the Topping 830 Pro, and since I already explained how this works for DACs, I don't need to explain this again for amplifiers, and it's the same thing for the number on the bottom left. However, there is no real necessary limit to the VRMS or voltage output of an amplifier, because after all, the purpose of it is to get headphones loud. But again, as long as our headphones are efficient, we do not need that much power. I alluded to this in the DAC section, but there's one more important factor to consider for amplifiers' dynamic range aside from the load impedance. At a lower output level, the dynamic range will be lower. For example, at 50 millivolts of output, The dynamic range of the topping A30 Pro is 95 dB, which is right around the maximum level for CD quality. Whereas at medium gain, 4 volts in, 4 volts out, we are getting 128 dB of dynamic range. The dynamic range of the Apple dongle is actually quite high at 113 dB, and you have to keep in mind that this is for the maximum output level though, but in general, super high dynamic range levels don't really matter because songs don't even have that high level of dynamic range in the first place. Something I mentioned earlier with the Apple dongle measuring with a certain amount of distortion for an open load is very relevant here. An open load refers to a load impedance or a headphone's impedance approaching infinity. Generally, as a headphone's impedance decreases, the distortion of an amplifier will increase. Simplified, impedance just means a resistance to current. However, since this is not a physics class, I'm not going to fully explain what exactly all of these things mean. However, from this video, you should have gained enough practical knowledge to understand where exactly all of these things apply in reality. Here we have the total harmonic distortion plus noise versus output voltage for the Apple dongle at various frequencies and at various load impedances. Starting off with the 350 ohm load, which is as good as an open load effectively. At 1 kHz, we can see that distortion is at its lowest. At 20 Hz, while the distortion is higher, it is still inaudible as it is clearly below minus 80 dB, and the important part is that it is not clipping here. Moving to 10 ohms, we can see that distortion increases and that the Apple dongle clips at around 0.6 VRMS. When I say clipping, I'm referring to when at around 0.6 VRMS, the THD plus N versus output voltage line goes straight up, meaning that the system is hard distorting. This can come across audibly as a crackling noise or something similar. Up to the clipping point, however, distortion is not audible. Focus on the blue line in this image, which is for the standard US Apple dongle. From an open load down to 20 ohms, the Apple dongle does not clip. However, for a load impedance below that and the Apple dongle turned up to maximum volume, clipping can occur. But this is one of those things that just because the impedance of your headphones is below 20 ohms, it does not mean that it will clip on the Apple dongle as long as you have enough headroom, meaning enough volume left prior to maximum. Now, onto whether something is loud enough or not. Let us use the Apple dongle as the amplifier in our case, and any headphone with an impedance of 20 ohms or higher. As long as the headphone is loud enough, it is driven properly. This is one of the most common misconceptions in audio when it comes to understanding power requirements. The maximum output voltage of the Apple dongle is 1 VRMS. This determines the peak loudness of a headphone in a song, not the average volume. So if you have an amp with a ton of power that measures well, and you lower the volume to match that of the headphone on the Apple dongle for, let's say, a 1 kHz tone, the loudest sounds will be played at the exact same volume since the output voltages of the amplifiers are matched. In short, with the Apple dongle above 20 ohms, it's either loud enough or it's not. There are various headphone loudness calculators you can use, and this is useful to determine what amplifiers will be enough to power your headphones. The two things you need are the headphone's impedance and its sensitivity. Based on the headphone's impedance, you want to find the amplifier's max output voltage or wattage at that impedance. With that, you can determine how loud the headphone will get on that amplifier. In general, you want an amplifier that can get the headphones to at least 110 dB at the loudest to make sure that you never run into a situation where the headphones are not loud enough. Regarding frequency response, we want a flat frequency response in the audible band, 20 Hz to 20 kHz, but we can have more below that or more above that. It doesn't really matter. There is no specific frequency cutoff for a filter like there is for a DAC. And of course, we want good channel matching, meaning that the right channel and the left channel are at the same volume. Next, crosstalk is an interesting measurement, because this is very easy to hear differences between when you're using test tones. What crosstalk shows is how much sound leaks from one channel into the other. The easiest way to determine an amplifier's crosstalk is to go into a tone generator and turn the volume 100% to the right and have 0% playing on the left side. Take out the right headphone if you want and simply listen to the left side. If you hear any tone, that means there is audible crosstalk. However, this test isn't really that important above maybe minus 40 dB because songs are mastered on speakers and you can hear sounds from the right channel in your left ear anyways. In addition, you will be very hard pressed to find a song that has a sound playing 100% on one side and 0% on the other. The final topic is output impedance. In general, we want the output impedance of the amplifier to be as low as possible. The reason for this is to do with something called the damping factor. To calculate the damping factor, divide the load impedance by the source impedance. Basically, the higher the damping factor, the less volume you're losing. I'll talk a little bit more about this in the cables chapter right after this. For an amplifier with an output impedance that is the same at all frequencies, and a headphone with a flat load impedance, the frequency response of the headphone will not change depending on the amplifier's output impedance, as long as the output impedance of the amplifier is flat. However, if the load impedance of the headphone is not flat, like is the case for the 64 Audio U18T, which I have here, the magnitude response of the U18T is shown here. Now, as output impedance of the amplifier increases, assuming that the impedance is the same at all frequencies, the damping factor will be highest where there are impedance peaks in the headphone, meaning that when normalized for volume, the effective tonal balance of the headphone after increasing the amplifier's output impedance will be shifted more towards these impedance peaks. The final thing I want to talk about in the amplifiers chapter is balanced versus unbalanced audio, and this also relates to DACs as well. There are essentially two advantages to using balanced audio. As we can see here, we have the single-ended measurement of the topping D30 Pro DAC, and now we have the balanced measurement of the topping D30 Pro DAC. As you can see, if you were paying attention, the output voltage doubled. This is one of the two advantages of balanced audio. With the same circuitry, you can double the voltage. The second advantage is that if you have a ground loop, which is a hum you might hear with your amplifier aside from the noise floor, you can eliminate it with the balanced DAC or amplifier. Onto the cable section, this isn't really that hard to explain from a sound quality perspective, but firstly, different headphones can have different connector types. For example, the Moondrop Variations has a recessed 2-pin, meaning that there is an indent present where the 2-pin goes into the IEM, and there's also non-recessed 2-pin, so when you're buying replacement cables for your earphones, you need to keep these things in mind. There's also MMCX, and there are even some proprietary earphone connectors like Linem's T2, and if you have a balanced headphone, for example, you might need different cables. So as far as, what headphone cables you need for connectivity, it's really self-explanatory, and this video is mostly focused on sound quality, so I'm not really going to get into that much. But to put it simply, the only real factor that determines a cable's quote-unquote sound quality is the resistance. In the amplifier section, I mentioned output impedance relating to volume loss. It's the same thing with cables. A higher resistance cable will lower the maximum volume of an earphone, and from an earphone or headphone's perspective, a higher impedance cable will have the same effect on the magnitude response as a higher output impedance amplifier. And there are some other more miscellaneous topics like the Moondrop Variations not being wired technically correctly. Based on 2-pin convention, you'll see this blue dot on most cables. I don't know if it's going to come up in this camera, but hopefully it does. And that would normally go into the front side of the earphone, but the Variations is wired incorrectly for inverted polarity, and I'll get into that more later in the headphone section. But basically for that, you would need to make sure that you insert the cable the technically incorrect way, but it would actually be the correct way for an earphone like the Moondrop Variations. That is if you want high fidelity sound reproduction. Often cable manufacturers don't actually quote the resistance values of their earphone, but some people like Rikudo Goku have databases where they have measured earphone cables and have this for people to use to determine what they want to purchase. And in general, thicker cables should have lower resistance due to having more conductive material, but sometimes this is not the case due to poor manufacturing or design. I don't really know, but whatever is measured is the truth, basically. And all things being equal, a cable with an inline microphone or volume control will have a higher resistance value than a cable without any of those features, so keep that in mind when looking for cables as well. Now, onto the speaker section. Double-blind tests over the decades have shown that listeners prefer speakers with a flat on-axis response and smooth directivity curves. Now, what does this mean? In an anechoic chamber, when you measure a speaker, it should measure as a horizontal line, meaning that the sound coming directly from the speaker is flat. And if you don't know what an anechoic chamber is, it means that all reflections are absorbed by the room, so the only thing you hear at the listening position is what is coming directly from the speaker. Other measurements can be gathered from an anechoic chamber, such as the early reflections curve and the sound power curve. Early reflections generally refers to sounds that arrive at the listener within the first 60 milliseconds. Sound power describes sound waves propagating from a source uniformly in all directions. A cheaper alternative to using a multi-million-dollar anechoic chamber to measure speakers is something called the Klippel near-field scanner, which is not cheap either at around over $100,000 for its cost. Now, with the information gathered in the graph I just showed, which is known as a spinorama, the predicted in-room response can be calculated for typically furnished domestic rooms and home theaters. The formula is 12% direct sound, 44% early reflections, and 44% sound power. As you can see here, for this speaker, the predicted in-room response is very close to the actual in-room response. The horizontal and vertical directivity curves show how much room you have to move around and for the response to not change significantly. In the left, you can see the angles, and if you stay within the certain angles where you're in the red area, this means that the response is not going to notably change on the speakers, at least perceived by you. This relates to what frequencies you should EQ on speakers, but before talking about that, I want to explain why the lower frequencies have a greater red area or a sweet spot than higher frequencies. For example, if we look at the Apple HomePod, we can see a much wider sweet spot. This is because the Apple HomePod is an omnidirectional speaker. When looking at the Apple HomePod, you can see that there's no really distinct tweeter or woofer, so even if you move around the room, it's still going to sound the same. Versus the Genelec having a clear tweeter, it is within the woofer, but this is because it is a coaxial speaker, more on that later. But obviously, if you move completely to the side of the speaker, it's not going to sound the same as sitting right in front of it. Also, if a speaker does not extend to at least 20 Hz, you want to use subwoofers so you can hear the full spectrum. And if a speaker does extend to 20 Hz on its own, you still might want to use a subwoofer in case its harmonic distortion is very high, meaning that as sound pressure increases, bass frequencies will lower proportionately because of a lower max excursion limit, which as a result you see higher total harmonic distortion. The advantage of a coaxial speaker like the Genelec A341A over a traditional speaker with a separated tweeter and woofer like the Neumann KH80 is a more controlled vertical directivity curve. The distance between the tweeter and the woofer causes phase interference where the wavelengths of sound are very similar and interacting with each other. In the vertical directivity contour, you can see an anomaly of sorts below 2 kHz for the Neumann KH80 versus on the Genelec A341A, it has no such problem. This will also manifest itself in the sound power directivity index, and often in the earlier reflections directivity index. And assuming a perfectly flat on-axis response, the earlier reflections and sound power curves are essentially just inverses of the earlier reflections and sound power directivity indexes. So if the on-axis response is flat and you see a peak in the sound power directivity index, there will also be a dip in the sound power curve, resulting in a dip in the in-room response. Now, we do not want to equalize this dip so that the estimated in-room response becomes more closer to the red line we see here. This is because above the room transition frequency, also known as the Schrödinger frequency, on-axis sounds or direct sound is perceptually dominant. We do not want to damage a flat on-axis response for a smoother in-room response. The frequency at which you should cross the main speakers to the subwoofers often depends on what frequencies your main speakers can comfortably play. But generally, most decent speakers can play comfortably below 150 Hz, so the subwoofers should be crossed to the main speakers below that point. Usually for traditional loudspeakers, high-pass filters are not used when crossing over to subwoofers, only the low-pass filter is used on the subwoofer designating the crossover frequency, and this can manifest itself sort of like a steeper rise below 200 Hz. Phase response anomalies can be audible in speakers, but instead of talking about this both in the speakers and headphones section, I'll save most of the talk for the headphone section. But in general, phase response issues are easier to hear on headphones than in speakers because you do not have effects of the room masking phase issues from the speakers essentially. I will talk about cardioid speakers in the room section coming up. Onto the room section. I'm not going to spend too much time here because ultimately this video is about headphones. And most of my research into rooms has been for better understanding context regarding headphones. The information in this section will be universal for any room size. The concept of listening to a recording in the purest form possible is a point of controversy. Because on one hand, reflections in a room add sonic characteristics that are not present in the recording. On the other hand, it can be argued that the purpose of a sound reproduction system is to bring the artist to your room. Neither approach is technically wrong, but I will be detailing some key differences. I brought up the difference in vertical directivity between a Genelec and Neumann speaker. Aside from the sweet spot area, this has another effect. When you have a reflective ceiling and/or floor, sounds will reflect off of the ceiling and/or floor and come back to you. When a speaker has good vertical directivity, this isn't much of a problem because the timbre of the recording is still preserved. For example, in this graph of the Genelec A361A, which is a coaxial loudspeaker, you can see that the shaping of the ceiling bounce and floor bounce are similar to that of the sidewall bounce. However, for a traditional loudspeaker like the Neumann KH420, we can see dips in the ceiling bounce and floor bounce. This is owing to its worse vertical directivity. There is an option to get rid of these dips though with the Neumann. If your ceiling and/or floor is untreated, and if you install foam on the ceiling and carpet on the floor, the vertical reflections can be absorbed, and you will not hear a dip at the listening position. So now I want to talk about what people actually prefer in specific circumstances. Here we have a formula, R equals L diffuse minus L direct. L direct is the anechoic on-axis frequency response, and L diffuse is the sound power, which I explained previously. For music, listeners generally prefer higher levels of diffuse sound versus speech-dominated content, for example. For why this is, we simply have to rely on intuition. With music, we mostly want to feel immersed. When listening to speech-dominated content, we want to hear what the person is saying clearly, and a higher level of diffuse sound technically worsens clarity in absolute terms. There is no real right or wrong answer here, but obviously first it's easiest to start with an untreated room and go from there. In a blind test to determine preferred treatment type for setting the level of a song with mixing and mastering engineers, of the 3 treatment types, diffusion, absorption, and reflection, most listeners actually chose reflection, which represents a bare room. This is not to say that the other options are wrong, but it's something to keep in mind. On to more necessary room treatment approaches, as well as what the advantage of cardioid loudspeakers are. Here we have 2 different dispersion graphs, one for a typical subwoofer and one for a cardioid subwoofer. In the graph of the typical subwoofer, sound is being output equally in all directions versus the cardioid subwoofer primarily outputting sound forward. The same thing applies for traditional loudspeakers. Bass frequencies are more omnidirectional than higher frequencies. When a traditional loudspeaker is placed in front of a wall, a problem known as speaker boundary interference can occur. Not all of the frequencies that bounce off of the back wall will reverse in phase. But if a sound wave in a solid strikes an air boundary, the pressure wave, which reflects back into the solid from the air boundary, will experience a phase reversal. This causes what is known as destructive interference. For example, at 200 Hz here, we see a dip in the response. This is because 200 Hz sound waves initially moving forward from the speaker are in a specific phase, but the 200 Hz sound waves which are reflecting off of the back wall, and combining with the 200 Hz sound waves being output from the speaker in the forward direction, are in opposite phase. So the solution to this is cardioid dispersion loudspeakers. When the sound waves from a speaker that go in the backward direction are inconsequential, speaker boundary interference is also inconsequential. For example, in an untreated room, the Key 3, a cardioid dispersion loudspeaker, does not show significant boundary interference response. However, for traditional loudspeakers, this can also be addressed with room treatment. This is commonly addressed by placing foam panels behind the loudspeakers. This prevents sound waves being reflected by the back wall, and combining with sound waves radiating in the forward direction from the loudspeaker. With an insufficient number of subwoofers and/or improper placement, the low frequency response can differ greatly depending on listening position. So in order to satisfy the maximum number of listeners, it is important to have an adequate number of subwoofers in proper placement. For example, if you had 5,000 subwoofers in a room, bass response would be identical across all listening positions. For practical results, we ideally want 1 subwoofer in the front of the room and in the back of the room, or add 2 subwoofers to the side of the room on top of that, or have a subwoofer in each corner of the room. Finally, I want to talk about what frequencies you should equalize. I will talk about equalization specifically a bit more in the headphones section, but there is a frequency known as the Schrödinger frequency or the room transition frequency. This frequency represents the point at which direct sound becomes perceptually dominant or the sound coming directly from the speaker. For normal-sized rooms, this is at about 500 Hz. Now, when you have a flat on-axis response, you do not want to equalize for a smoother in-room response above the room transition frequency based on steady state or in-room measurements. This is because what you see is actually caused by off-axis colorations, and adjusting the in-room response for this will result in a damaged direct sound. And since that is perceptually dominant, it will result in worse perceived sound quality. Now, below the room transition frequency, sound is perceived as mostly omnidirectional, meaning that you can equalize for a smoother in-room response below the room transition frequency for no perceived negatives. Next, I want to talk about mastering in the song creation process and highlight Bob Katz's book. Bob Katz is a famous mastering engineer with 3 Grammy Awards. The most important thing he says is here: even the best master will sound different everywhere, but it will sound most correct on an accurate monitor system. Note that this isn't necessarily best sounding. We are only looking for the highest fidelity sound reproduction. He goes over the elements of a high-resolution monitor system. Firstly, he says that near-field monitors will not be used in a professional mastering room. He then says that the noise floor of the mastering room is very quiet, which also makes perfect sense. There are no significant obstacles between the monitors and the listeners within the standard equilateral monitoring triangle. Note that the equilateral triangle is not necessarily used everywhere, but In terms of angle of incidence, a speaker that is directly in front of a listener is considered 0 degrees on the vertical plane. In the equilateral triangle, speakers are angled 30 degrees inwards from a 0-degree angle of incidence. We can see distances between the speakers and listener and the speaker, but this isn't the point of the video, so I'm not going to talk more about this, but it is worth keeping in mind. The electronic chain is designed for maximum transparency, meaning that we do not want tube amps or something that colors the sound obviously. Monitor speakers and amplifiers have wide bandwidth, high headroom, and extremely flat frequency response, and a speaker which has these characteristics is the Genelec A361A as an example. Monitors and listeners are in reflection-free zones. He gives some numbers for what exactly he thinks this means, but as I showed you earlier, this isn't necessarily something that is set in stone and can even differ among professional mastering engineers. What's mostly important is that the speaker quality is good. The room is large enough to permit even, extended bass response with no significant standing waves, and of course, we want a smooth bass response, and standing waves are essentially the opposite of speaker boundary interference when you have destructive interference. Instead, standing waves are caused by constructive interference. On one hand, with speaker boundary interference response, you cannot equalize the missing frequencies back into the response. But with standing waves, you can simply equalize down the frequencies, or use room treatment to address the standing waves. He says that room length should be at least 20 feet long, which again is not necessarily a standard, but maybe he likes it that way. The room should be wide enough so that first reflections from the side walls are insignificant, and again, if that's what he wants, that's fine, but it is important to keep in mind that a mastering engineer is not adjusting the location of instruments in a mix. They are mainly focused on the tonal balance. He says that stereo subwoofers or prime loudspeakers whose response extends to infrasonic are essential for good mastering, and this might be true for a single listening position, but as I said in the room section, there are more optimal placement for satisfying the maximum number of listeners. Here is Bobcat's mastering room, for example. We can see 2 large main loudspeakers and 2 stereo subwoofers. And of course, it is important to have a system that extends to below 20 Hz. And regarding the first thing I brought up in this section, some people say that songs are engineered to be listened on Apple AirPods, but this is completely false. Most successful mastering engineers use wide-range flat response systems. Recordings will sound most correct on these systems, not on Apple AirPods. For what level songs are mastered at, Bobcats recommends 83 dB, and this is sort of a de facto standard, but the range is somewhere between 81 and 85 dB depending on the mastering engineer. For example, in the October 2013 Harman loudspeaker and headphone preference tests, they set the playback level to 82 dB. It is important to keep in mind different weightings for SPL. It is mentioned that Harman used C weighting, which factors in the lowest and highest frequencies less. It is important to keep in mind that this 83 dB SPL is for the average level. Crest factor is the difference between the average level of a musical passage and its instantaneous peak level. For example, if a specific passage measures at -20 dB fs on the averaging meter, and the highest momentary peak is -3 dB fs on the peak meter, it has a crest factor of 17 dB. If the average recorded level is -20 dB fs and the peak recorded level is 0 dB fs, the peak SPL level will be 103 dB. However, there are certain instances of songs, notably in the bass area, where the crest factor can be extremely high, resulting in a high peak SPL level even though the average SPL level can still be 83 dB. The accuracy of this will depend on your headphones used, but the Moondrop variations, which are the earphones I use, are pretty close in sensitivity to the Apple EarPods, so I'm assuming that this is relatively correct, but my average listening level is around 83 dB, and since the Moondrop variations are a very accurate playback system, it makes sense that the preferred level would be 83 dB since that's where it sounds most correct. One more thing regarding mastering is absolute polarity. By convention, absolute polarity is correct when the loudspeaker moves outward. The semantics of this are not technically correct, but that is beyond the scope of this video. The point is that when fed with a positive impulse response is measured from the speaker, and I will get into impulse response in the headphones section. Now, how do we translate this to headphones is what you must be asking, and to answer that we have to get into the head-related transfer function, or head-related transfer functions. Before talking about the head-related transfer function, I suppose it is important to mention how exactly headphones are measured nowadays. Firstly, we start off with something that is known as a coupler, which simulates the average acoustic impedance of the human ear canal and eardrum, and this is all we typically need for measuring in-ear monitors. Next, we can add a pinna or outer ear to that. To go even further, we could add a head and torso, which is known as a head and torso simulator. But the most important thing to keep in mind is that headphone measurements are usually eardrum measurements. So to translate a speaker measurement to a headphone measurement, the intuition is that you measure the response of an optimal speaker at a listener's eardrum and create a headphone target. But it isn't as simple as this. To give a bit of a backstory, first real headphone target that tried to be a standard was the free field target, and this is derived either through an average of listeners or from the head and torso simulator. But essentially, you place a listener in front of a loudspeaker in an anechoic chamber and measure the response at the listener's eardrum. This is known as the free field target, which you can see in this image compared to diffuse field. However, there is a problem with this. When you listen to a headphone equalized to the free field target, sounds do not appear as if they are coming from in front of you. This is due to two factors. Firstly, when listening to headphones, there are no interaural time and intensity differences, meaning that sounds arriving at the right ear are not arriving later at the left ear and reduced in level like they would be in speakers, and vice versa. Secondly, the conditions for deriving the free field target are not minimum phase. I will get into this a bit more in the headphones section, but headphones are mostly minimum phase devices. When you simply use the magnitude response of the free field target, without accounting for the non-minimum phase behavior, let alone the lack of interaural time and intensity differences, listening to a headphone equalized to the free field target sounds nothing like the conditions under which it was derived. Here we have something called the Gestalt perception model proposed by Gunter Thiel. It shows how, in passing through the outer ear, sound is subject to HRTF spectral modification. This modification is used by the brain to help determine the sound source's location, and then inverse filtering is applied to prevent the timbre of the sound from being distorted. Moving on to the last paragraph, Thiel contended that because the headphone image has no preferred direction, the ideal headphone frequency response would be that which pertains at the ear in a diffuse sound field, where sound arrives equally from all directions. And some comments from Floyd Toole on this topic are, Thiel incorporates this in his association model of hearing, in which timbre is an effect associated with direction. We expect sounds from different directions to have somewhat different timbres because that is one of the clues helping us to figure out what direction it is coming from. Once the direction is identified, it seems that we apply a kind of correction so we are not distracted by the timbre shift. Since the diffuse field target is the eardrum response at a listener of a speaker that measures flat at the listening position steady state, on an omnidirectional microphone, at a location where sound incidence is considered independent of direction, it is considered minimum phase, which represents the behavior of headphones. For the free field target, dependent on direction head-related transfer function plus independent of direction magnitude response equals timbrally incorrect. With the diffuse field target, independent of direction head-related transfer function plus independent of direction magnitude response equals timbrally correct. Now, since individuals can have considerably different diffuse field eardrum responses, it is important to know at exactly what point individual variation largely kicks in. In the top middle image here, we can see what is known as the ear canal blocked entrance, which is the reference point for in-ear headphones. Now, aside from at very high frequencies, for a diffuse field to the ear canal blocked entrance, individuals are actually not differing that much. And for over-ear headphones, which you can see are represented by the bottom two images, the difference between individuals is actually not that big. So as long as you are relatively close to the average listener's diffuse field to ear canal blocked entrance head-related transfer function, an IEM that measures well relative to the average diffuse field to eardrum head-related transfer function will sound good to you because differences would be accounted for in your ear canal to eardrum. For this reason, though, it is important that ear simulators or head and torso simulators are accurate. The diffuse field target I showed in the previous image was determined by Hammershoy and Mahler in 2008 by averaging the diffuse field to eardrum responses of over 40 individuals. If you go to any squig.link graphing database, this is the diffuse field target you will see. The IEC 711 coupler aims to simulate the average acoustic impedance of the human ear to eardrum between 100 Hz and 10 kHz. The Gross RA0402 aims to extend this to 20 kHz. If you keep measurement equipment adequacies in mind, this diffuse field target is valid to use as a point of reference. When looking at the 3 kHz peak in earphone or headphone measurements, some people refer to this as pinna gain, but this is technically incorrect since the gain introduced by the pinna is actually not that substantial at 3 kHz. The 3 kHz peak is mostly caused by the ear canal and eardrum. Now, for how this is applied, we will get into the headphone section now. Now, I have covered a lot of prerequisite material in this video for fully understanding headphones, so I don't want to spend too much time repeating myself, but rather I want to use this section to combine everything I have said so far. So, we know how a good speaker measures, and we know what HRTF we want to use as a starting point. If a traditional loudspeaker that has a flat anechoic response and good directivity measures with the downward tilt in a good room using an omnidirectional microphone steady state, and the diffuse field target is our point of reference, if we compensate for the diffuse field target, we can compare headphone measurements to speaker measurements. There is not necessarily a 100% objectively best target, but there are qualities of a good curve. This is one of my older in-ear targets, for example. It was derived from taking the Harman 2019 bass profile and combining it with a smooth downward sloping diffuse field response. Most listeners who try this target out report that it sounds very natural. I personally prefer a bit more bass than this target. Keep in mind that this is only for in-ears, but I find that since in-ear headphones are lacking the physical bass sensation you might get with headphones or especially speakers, increasing bass allows for more realistic perceived timbre to me. Bass is really the only region where significant subjectivity is allowed. We don't really want to touch mid-range and high frequencies more aside from slightly changing the slope or high frequency roll-off. Harman discovered that listeners preferred more bass with in-ear headphones than with over-ear headphones in double-blind test conditions. I fully agree with this because with over-ear headphones I don't feel the need to add nearly as much bass as I do with in-ear headphones. If you compare my target to Harman 2016, which is where the bass was originally derived for this target, you will notice that my target has a little bit more bass than Harman 2016. My theory for why this is because for the Harman 2016 target, 10 listeners were chosen with the average age being 43.5 years old. And as you can see in this image, older listeners generally preferred less bass than younger listeners. This data is for the over-ear target, but the common trend is that if someone is to prefer less bass than the Harman target, they are likely female, untrained, or over 50 years old. But keep in mind that this data is also for a limited sample of headphones that might deviate significantly from the Harman target in other areas. If you want to read more about it, there are 2 papers on this topic. The first is a statistical model that predicts listener preference ratings of around-ear and on-ear headphones, and the second is segmentation of listeners based on their preferred headphone sound quality profiles. The reason the bass shelf location and filter type was chosen for the Harman target is due to several reasons. First, the majority of subwoofers are crossed over to the main speaker near or slightly below this frequency, so there are practical reasons to start from here. Secondly, variations in bass level due to acoustical interactions between loudspeakers and rooms occur near and below near this frequency. Thirdly, informal investigations by authors found that extending the bass shelf frequency to above 105 Hz had an adverse effect on the timbre of vocals and other instruments whose fundamental pitches fall within this frequency region. On the other hand, boosting the bass below 150 to 200 Hz tends to enhance bass instruments without impacting the sound quality of the higher pitched instruments. The underlying reason for this is masking. Masking caused by a 100 Hz fundamental of the same level as a 200 Hz fundamental is significantly less. If you want an example of an in-ear headphone that complies very well to these standards, the Moondrop Variations is what I personally use, and as you can see, aside from this 1.5 kHz peak, which actually is a real issue with the earphones, they sound essentially perfect. The peak at around 8 kHz is caused by the IEC 711 coupler used and is not actually present in a real ear. You will often see for IEC 711 measurements that there is an 8 kHz peak. This is caused by the coupler overestimating that frequency region. There are a few more factors to keep in mind besides magnitude response. Starting off, even I have said this incorrectly a few times in this video, but the true meaning of frequency response is currently being misrepresented. Frequency response can only be defined when you have both the magnitude and phase response. With only one or the other, you do not have a frequency response. When you measure an earphone with a coupler using software like Room EQ Wizard, you will get both the magnitude and phase response. In the top line, we can see the measured phase response of the Moondrop Variations. This essentially shows, irrespective of magnitude response, the timing of different frequencies. As we can see, it is at around minus 180 degrees up to around 10 kHz. But the measured phase response alone has no importance. What we want is the excess phase response. To find that, we subtract the minimum phase response from the measured phase response. The minimum phase response is calculated via something known as the Hilbert transform, and shows the expected timing of frequencies based on the magnitude response. Now that we have the excess phase response, we can take out the minimum phase response and measured phase response. As we can see, up to 10 kHz, it is flat at minus 180 degrees. Generally, phase shifts are much more audible at lower frequencies than they are at higher frequencies, and phase shifts past 10 kHz are really not going to matter audibly. There is a problem with this graph though. The excess phase is at minus 180 degrees, but we want it to be at 0 degrees. As you can see, the measured phase response is about minus 180 degrees, the minimum phase response. This is caused by the Moondrop Variations by default having inverted polarity. Many earphones do this nowadays for very dumb reasons, but if you want high fidelity sound reproduction, you have to correct this yourself. The reason polarity inversion is audible is because the ear acts as a half-wave rectifier, and the negative half of the waveform is inaudible to us. When playing a pure sine wave, for example, the top and bottom halves of the waveform are identical, so flipping the polarity will not result in a change. However, for any asymmetrical waveform, as with any type of music basically, you can hear a change in inverted polarity since the waveform is not the same on the top and the bottom. I will play two sound samples here for a guitar, one in correct polarity and one in incorrect polarity. The first one will be correct polarity, so hopefully you can hear the difference if you're using headphones at least. As you can see, when looking at the minimum phase impulse response and measured impulse response, the measured impulse response is moving in the opposite direction of the minimum phase impulse response. To correct this with a 2-pin earphone, if that is what you have, if this is the default orientation of your earphone, you simply reverse the 2-pin orientation by flipping the connector 180 degrees and boom, polarity is fixed. So after doing that, you can see that the minimum phase response and measured phase response are very similar, in that the excess phase response is 0 degrees up to 10 kHz, and I wouldn't worry much about phase shifts aside from this because all passive IEMs are going to measure essentially the same in this regard, once polarity is accounted for at least. Even though passive IEMs are generally minimum phase, this is not necessarily the case for true wireless earphones or DSP earphones. DSP stands for digital signal processing. All true wireless earphones have inherent latency, meaning that they cannot be minimum phase. Take for example the Codecs DSP. At 20 Hz, the excess phase is near 0 degrees, but at 5 kHz, the excess phase is near minus 570 degrees. Ignoring the fact that it says that the impulse response is starting before the 0-second mark, the impulse response of the Codecs DSP is not following the minimum phase impulse response. Since the phase is negative at 5 kHz relative to 20 Hz, 5 kHz is arriving earlier than expected relative to the magnitude response. To calculate the timing difference, 5 kHz means 5,000 cycles per second. Since one full cycle is 360 degrees, and since 570 divided by 360 is approximately 1.6, we know that frequencies at 5 kHz are arriving approximately 1.6 cycles earlier than expected. Since there are 5,000 cycles in a second here, the difference is actually not that big. 1.58, which was the exact number, divided by 5,000 times 1,000 gives us 0.32 milliseconds. For minimum phase systems like the Moondrop variations, group delay does not actually show anything useful since the minimum phase group delay is the same as the measured group delay, or essentially the same, resulting in a flat excess group delay. If there is a lot of phase change in a given frequency region, it could still have a constant slope giving you a flat excess group delay, so it really does not tell you anything useful. In addition, inverted polarity will not show up in group delay because the slope of the excess phase is not changed when you invert the polarity. Audio Science Review looks at the measured group delay for some reason, but this is completely pointless since for any minimum phase system, anything in the measured group delay will be in the magnitude response. Some of these measurements are relatively unimportant for headphones, but they're worth keeping in mind. One graph people often like to look at is the waterfall plot, and again for minimum phase systems this is completely useless, since ringing in the time domain can be corrected by fixing a peak in the magnitude response. For distortion, obviously as close to 0% as possible is preferred because you are reproducing the signal more accurately. However, realistically, second and third order distortion harmonics, which are most common with headphones and earphones, are the most difficult to hear as they are masked by the fundamental. When headphones are at their max excursion limit and clipping, you will see a spike in much higher harmonics which are very easy to hear. So aside from those edge cases, I really would not worry about second and third order harmonic distortion much. Even though all else being equal, I would take the earphone with lower harmonic distortion. Intermodulation distortion is essentially the same thing as it is for DACs and amps. And again, for most earphones and headphones, this is quite inconsequential. For over-ears though, distortion does play a bigger role in bass, especially if you want to boost frequencies. And Audio Science Review is actually a great resource for this, where he posts distortion graphs at higher volumes. Regarding some more good-to-know information with headphones, particularly for glasses users, oftentimes with the bad seal, you will get a significantly reduced bass response, as you can see in this Mark Levinson headphone for example. However, there are headphones with very low resonant frequencies, like the Headphone Aria, which do not really suffer from seal breaches. In addition, some headphones will have better frequency response consistency with positional variance than others. There's no real just look at the photo of a headphone and you'll know how this is. You kind of have to see measurement data for this. The main thing to keep in mind, aside from making sure that your seal is good within your headphones, is insertion depth. Treble response can vary a bit depending on how deep you insert the earphones. The 8 kHz peak, for example, which shows up on the IEC 711 is dependent on insertion depth. The deeper you insert, the higher in frequency this peak will appear at. And obviously, the shallower you insert, the earlier in frequency this peak will appear at. Generally, the best over-ear headphones will have worse treble smoothness than even the best in-ear headphones. To understand this, we have to think about speakers in a room. Acoustical interference mainly occurs at lower frequencies, but as we shrink the room size to a very small size like we have with headphones on your ear, acoustical interference issues can occur in the treble. With in-ear headphones, since the room size is effectively so small, you can get an extremely smooth response. Dan Clark attempted to address this with the stealth and expanse with his metamaterial technology or whatever it's called, but apparently there's actually quite high positional variance with that headphone, so that's something to keep in mind. Also, for quote-unquote soundstage differences between closed back and open back headphones, there was actually a study done on this when frequency response was fully accounted for as a variable, and it was found out that there were no statistically significant differences. If you have one headphone and you measure it on 2 different measurement rigs, you can plot the difference curve. However, this difference curve will only apply to this specific headphone. Every headphone will have different compensation curves when measured on 2 different rigs. This is due to acoustic impedance differences between headphones and acoustic load differences between different ears and heads, but there's no point really talking about what exactly this means here. Just know that the difference between one headphone measured on one rig versus another does not necessarily apply to a different headphone measured on one rig versus another. To give a quick demonstration on EQ real quick, let's use the Truthier Hexa since it has a pretty smooth response. Although it has inverted polarity, you can easily fix this yourself. So let's say I want to EQ this to my target. We'll just go char target. Oh wow, the response is already very smooth, especially past 8 kHz, which is like nearly impossible to EQ anyways. What you can easily do is auto EQ, but maybe you want to know how to do this yourself. I don't know, whatever the reason might be, but like, okay, let's say we have a dip at 6500 hertz. We just go, you can like experiment with it a little bit, but it's not like that complicated. But yeah, okay, that looks pretty good. And then we go to like 2300 hertz, maybe 3 dB, 2Q, looks about right. Then we want to reduce this 1300 hertz peak. Yeah, it looks about perfect. And then I'm not trying to make this like 100% exact match, but you can if you want, I guess. Let's see, we have 350 hertz. We reduce it by -2 and a Q of 1. Okay, that's a bit big. 1.5. Then, of course, yeah, I'm not trying to make this like perfect because like whatever. So we could do a low shell filter for lower frequencies and then like a gain of 4 dB and okay, wait. Okay, I sent this to the wrong thing. 100 hertz and then 200 hertz, 300 hertz. This is why I often use auto EQ, because it's just like a pain in the ass to do yourself. But yeah, if you use a low shell filter, it'll be like more of a steep rise like that. And yeah, okay, and setting it to a Q factor of 1 makes this like pretty much exactly what we want. The higher the Q factor for the shelf or even just regular peaking frequency band, it'll increase the sharpness of the filter, but the lower the Q value, the less sharp the filter will be. And if you use an EQ tool that doesn't have Q factor, but it has bandwidth, which is sometimes common, you can just use a calculator online to convert Q factor to bandwidth. So just like that, we have the Truthier Hexa EQ. Maybe there's like this dip here. We can just correct that. And yeah, see, just by eye, we have a pretty much perfect EQ for the Truthier Hexa. Yep, so that's just a quick demonstration on EQ. And for really high treble shards and stuff, it's going to be really difficult to EQ, especially since positional variance is going to be high, and the difference between what you see on the graph and what you hear in your ear is going to be a bit different for after 8 kHz especially. For lossy versus lossless audio, the question is whether there is an audible difference. Personally, the only lossy codec I haven't been able to pass a blind test with between that and lossless audio is for high bitrate Opus, which is generally considered the best lossy format. Even 320 kilobits per second MP3 I can easily tell versus lossless in most songs in an ABX test. AAC is a little bit harder, but I can still pass that. So Apple Music lossless is not transparent. Even whatever Spotify uses, 320 kilobits per second, OGG is not transparent. I can still blind test that versus lossless, and I'm not making this up. I have blind ABX results and can easily get over 99.9% confidence intervals in these tests. And I don't know of any streaming service that's using high bitrate Opus. So for me, I just use Apple Lossless, and it's kind of ironic when you think about the entire DAC amp thing and going for over 100 dB Synad or something, whatever the score is, and using Lossy music with like 20 dB Synad. Of course, it doesn't tell the whole story, but it is interesting. And one thing that's brought up sometimes is bit perfect. For example, when using Mac OS, and you're listening to a 48 kilohertz sample rate file with your system sample rate set at 44.1 kilohertz, the song has to be resampled to 44.1 kilohertz to match your system sample rate. However, distortion introduced by this is completely inaudible. As you can see here, we have all harmonics below minus 150 dB, and this applies for all frequencies, and the phase response of the sample rate conversion is flat. I already mentioned this in the DAC section, but I guess it's worth mentioning here for those who skipped that section or forgot about it. So if I take this song called Signs of Love, for example, and convert it to lame encoded 320 kilobits per second MP3 and invert one of the files, you can hear the information that is missing in the 320 kilobits per second MP3 file, and I will play that right here. So even though something might be technically perceptually transparent, maybe it's just safest to listen to lossless anyways, but lossy versus lossless can be sort of thought of as I'm chasing the last few percent of sonic accuracy or perfection, and it is worth accounting for, I guess, but it's not the biggest deal at the end of the day. What matters most is that your headphones have a good frequency response. And I guess that is the ultimate point of this video. With that said, I think that is it from me. So thank you guys for getting me to 5,000 subscribers, and I really hope this video was helpful to those who do not know anything about audio, or those who even did know a bit about audio and learned a thing or two. And even if you did know everything in this video, then I hope you enjoyed it anyways. So yeah, thank you guys a lot for 5,000 subscribers. It really means a lot to me. I hope we get to even greater heights one day, maybe like 10,000 subscribers. I don't know how long it'll take, but it is the goal. It is a goal. Yeah. Thank you to all of my fans, everyone who has supported me along this journey, I guess. It's kind of weird just thinking back, I guess. I mean, it had the whole DT880 arc. I was so dumb back then, the whole ER2SC arc. But I always said what I believed in, and maybe that was to my detriment a lot of the time, but I do think I am in a good place in audio understanding right now, and am in a place to talk to people and help them better understand sound quality. I'd like to give a shout out to Yuli, Felix, Mild Bill, Christopher Yu, the RFO Reaper, Tripped, Moonalos, Gabby D, Fofo, Xeruskun, Castello4141, Ninja Comet 3, Vsauce 4, Wadiaker, and Cinevri. Also, from the Discord server, I'd like to give a shout out to Tripped and Base Gamer. Thank you guys for supporting the channel. Be sure to join the Apple House Sound Discord server if you haven't, where we have tons of revolutionary discussions on audio, and is actually a great resource if you are new and maybe you want to talk more about the topics I discussed in this video. That's it from me. I'll see you guys next time. I'm out.